Thank you very much. That was a very nice introduction, and it's very nice to be here, or to be back here at Illinois. A lot of great things have happened at Illinois, and I want to just mention a couple of them before getting into the main topic. I think everybody here knows that the American Marketing Association was founded, I believe, in 1937 here at the University of Illinois. Illinois back in that era was particularly known as a football school, and it was the supreme powerhouse in football in America at that time. The most famous football player, of course, was Red Grange, called various nicknames to his prowess. His coach was Robert Zuebke, and a stranger to Champaign, Urbana, notices Zuebke Drive, Grange Avenue, and so on in honor of these two people who excelled so much. There is a somewhat sad story, however, to Coach Zuebke. He refused to adopt an innovation, and the innovation was that of giving football players fellowships. He saw this as the beginning of creeping commercialism of college football, which of course it was. And so he would have nothing to do with fellowships, no fellowships at Illinois. Needless to say, the football program at Illinois went downhill fast. So here is a famous person who refused to adopt an innovation. As many of you know, but some of you might not know, Coach Zuebke is buried parallel to the 50-yard line of Memorial Stadium in a cemetery. This was at his wish that he be buried parallel to the 50-yard line. Now, a little about Red Grange and how he has affected some important things also. He was elected to the Board of Trustees of the university, this in the years after his football greatness, and he wasn't a very active member, the record shows, in attending Board of Trustees meetings, but he did attend the most famous trustees meeting of all, which happened, I think, around 1954. The president of the University of Illinois at that time was a scholar named George Stoddard. He had taught, he was a psychologist, had taught at the University of Iowa, where he knew Wilbur Schramm. Now, Schramm is a very important name to me because he's widely considered the founder of the field of communication here at Illinois. Stoddard, the university president, wanted to hire Schramm, who he knew from Iowa U, and so in 1947 he made him a bargain that he couldn't say no to. President Stoddard hired Schramm to be the director of Allerton House, the editor of the University of Illinois Press, the director of the radio station, the director of the television station, director of Veterans Affairs, anything that had anything to do with communication. Schramm was in charge of it. In return, Schramm asked President Stoddard that he be allowed to start a department of at first an Institute of Communications Research, which would give the world's first PhDs in communication. This all happened at Illinois around 1947. So Schramm did all of these administrative jobs, and in the few minutes a week that he must have had left over, ran this first PhD program in the Institute of Communications Research. Now, Red Grange and President Stoddard come together in a famous midnight meeting of the Board of Trustees in the union. Is it the Illinois Union? Illinois Union? Yeah. And this was a meeting to determine whether the Board of Trustees had confidence in the president. They were concerned that he was very involved in UNESCO and in the world peace movement, and that he wasn't spending enough time as president here in Champaign, Urbana. So there was a vote of no confidence. It passed, so that was the end of Stoddard as president, and the deciding vote was that of Red Grange. Grange explained his vote by saying, this guy's been buying too many pianos. So Stoddard was out. That also meant the end of all these administrative jobs that Schramm was performing. So he was stripped in the weeks after this midnight meeting of being in charge of Allerton House. The wags in the faculty club at Illinois used to refer to Schramm as the Duke of Allerton. That was their favorite term for him. So he eventually went back to just being a professor. He was a tenured professor and running this PhD program, and it went much better after this no confidence in President Stoddard. So a lot of history has happened here in Illinois. Those are a couple of the high points as I know them, and I've been able to determine them. Let's now get into my presentation. Just for beginners, here's a quick definition of diffusion. It turns out that it's heavily a process of people talking to people, interpersonal communication, but more about that in the Bass model shortly. Next. Here's a definition of an innovation. It's very broad. Both the definition of diffusion and the definition of innovation are very broad. Innovation is sort of what you think it is. If it's new to you, if you perceive it as new, then it is an innovation. Next. This field really got underway with a study of the diffusion of hybrid seed corn, as many of you know. This was a study done at Iowa State University, and I want to tell you a little about this study because it has had such a long shadow on diffusion studies ever since. Bryce Ryan was a new PhD in sociology from Harvard University and accepted a faculty position at Iowa State. His main interest was in non-economic influences on farmers' economic decisions. Basically, he was trying to understand why didn't farmers choose the most economically wise choice when faced with such a choice. Neil Gross was a new master's student from an urban background in Milwaukee who came to Iowa State, and just as this project began, Ryan offered Gross a deal of the kind that professors have made to grad students over the years. He said, if you'll interview all these farmers for free, he's not talking about a research assistantship now, then you can use the data in your master's thesis, all of which came to pass. They selected 2 Iowa communities, and it happened that these 2 communities of Scranton and Jefferson were neighboring communities to where I was growing up at the time on an Iowa farm in western Iowa. My community was Carroll. Jefferson, incidentally, was where George Gallup came from. I can work the names of almost every one of the Converse. I won't, it would take too long. Anyway, one of the things that Ryan and Gross find is, amazingly, it took about 13 years for the average, well, for all the farmers in these 2 communities to reach 100% adoption. That despite the fact that hybrid corn increased their yields about 20%. So here are people delaying for many years to gain a 20% increase in the main crop that they were growing. This seemed surprising at the time. Furthermore, it took the average farmer about 7 years to adopt completely. That is, to go from planting part of their corn acreage to hybrid to planting all of their corn acreage. So 7 years of delay on the part of the individual farmer. This seemed, these were very surprising findings. How did I get trapped into this business? It happened very easily, I can tell you that, and very naturally. I had grown up on an Iowa farm, as I said, and I was puzzled. I had noted the same thing that Ryan and Gross found in their study. My father and other neighboring farmers were very reluctant in adopting agricultural innovations, and I was getting an education in high school and in college in technical agriculture, and I came home and worked on my father's farm every summer, and I was very puzzled as to why my father and our neighbors paid very little attention to what I told them, little pipsqueak that I was, about the latest and best in farming technology. Eventually, after getting a bachelor's degree at Iowa State in agriculture and serving in the Korean War, I came back to Iowa State to study diffusion research. Iowa State was sort of a mecca on this topic at that time. My dissertation actually was a study of the diffusion of 2,4-D weed spray in an Iowa community colony. So you can see this was a sort of parallel study to the hybrid seed corn study, different innovation, different community, but similar methodology. While I was preparing my review of literature for my dissertation, to my surprise, I found diffusion studies that had already been completed on the diffusion of educational innovations among schools, with some very similar findings. Likewise, there was a study here in Illinois in 4 communities of a new medical drug. It was tetracycline, which diffused among medical doctors, that is the prescription of this drug. And so I included these studies in my review of literature chapter, arguing that there was a general process of diffusion that seemed so obvious to me at the time. My committee, however, composed of 5 elderly gentlemen, were not so easily convinced. My data analysis was basically using multiple regression to predict innovativeness when farmers adopted 2,4-D weed spray. And there was a rather eminent econometrician on my committee, Professor Gerhard Tintner, a Viennese refugee to Ames, Iowa. And I was sure he was going to give me a difficult time about my beta weights. I was very uncertain about my beta weights. Well, we never got to the beta weights. We never got past the review of literature chapter, with committee members typically saying, now, Mr. Rogers, how can you maintain that the diffusion process applies to all kinds of people, to all kinds of innovations in all kinds of places, with all kinds of cultures? This is ridiculous. And so here I was with my weak little voice trying to argue against these eminences, and it didn't seem that I was convincing them at all. You see, I didn't really understand the purpose of a PhD exam. I had accepted a faculty position at Ohio State University, which began at 9 o'clock the following morning. This was midday in Ames, Iowa. So my wife was waiting with the engine of our Ford already running downstairs. And I turned my dissertation in the department office. And on my way out of the building, for I suppose the last time, who do I run into but Professor Tintner He's reading a book as he walks along, which was his habit. But when we pass each other, he says, "Oh, Dr. Rogers," he said, "your committee had many questions about how generalizable the diffusion model is." But he said, and this was over his shoulder as he walked off down the hall, "You could have an interesting book written out of your Review of Lit chapter." Well, I went down, joined my wife, and drove during the night to Columbus. I told her about this conversation. I said, "What a nutty old guy." And she said, "Well, you know," she said, "sometimes people tell you something, and at the time you think it's crazy, and then you find yourself doing it," as I did. Now, there's a little more to this general diffusion model. While I was at Iowa State, my advisor, George Beal, and another faculty member with whom he worked closely, Joe Bolin, were asked to make a presentation about diffusion to the extension workers of Iowa at their annual conference, which was in December of '54. And I helped them formulate this presentation in advance and then watched its enthusiastic reception. And they were arguing that there were two main things to the diffusion model, the innovation diffusion process. This is wonderful. You just cough and there's water. The innovation diffusion process, that is, that people first had to know about an innovation, then be persuaded, and then decide to adopt it and then implement it. And adopter categories, that not all farmers adopted at once, and what were the characteristics of the first farmers to adopt, and so on and so on. Their presentation was strictly about agricultural innovations. They were not interested in any of this silliness about a general diffusion model. But as their fame grew and as this presentation came to be in demand by various groups, soon they were giving talks to civil defense officials about the diffusion of home bomb shelters, which was an important innovation of that time. So it was beginning to be diffused and generalized. In 1962, I was at Ohio State at the time. I published the first book of the 5 editions, all but one of which was called Diffusion of Innovations. And at that time, there were about 400 diffusion publications. 2 of them were in marketing, and I'll say more about those later. The occasion for the decision to publish this book, I had sent it a prospectus for the book to 5 publishers, and 4 of them did not respond. But the editor of Free Press, headquartered at that time in Glencoe, Illinois, did. His name was Jeremiah Kaplan, and we met in Chicago at a conference in an old hotel that's no longer there, the Edgewater Beach Hotel, in the bar. He invited me to a meeting in the bar. Now, I'm the rural sociology professor from Ohio State. He's the urbane, big city slicker editor of an important publisher. So he's plying me with Manhattans. I had never heard of Manhattan until that day. And I think when he gets me to the right point, he tells me, I don't know why, but I'm going to publish your book. Now, I can't pay a very high royalty. We can't print it on very nice paper, and you can't have more than 30 figures in it because they cost more. But I'm going to publish it, and I'm going to publish it in 10,000 copies. But I'm sure that 10 years from now, we will be destroying most of those copies in our warehouse. So this is a very gloomy, unenthusiastic editor. Only in later years did I learn that that was his approach with every author. And indeed, he was wrong about the 10,000 copies being left over in the warehouse 10 years later. In this book, one of my main contributions in retrospect is I gave standard definitions of these terms and of how to measure them. This, of course, was very important in launching a general model of diffusion, one not limited to hybrid seed corn or to 2,4-D weed spray or to farmers. It made it possible or easier for anyone in any field to start using this model. And indeed, that began to happen. By the 70s, which was the second edition of my book in 1971, there were active sets of scholars studying diffusion in each of these fields and others, almost too many to keep track of. In fact, I've tried to keep track of how many diffusion publications are published each year, and it became increasingly difficult to do because I had to go to a greater and greater number of specialized journals. Here's a rough idea of the number of diffusion publications, as well as I could keep track of them by year or by decade, roughly, as editions of this book were published. Today, I think there's something more than 5,200 diffusion publications, but I don't think anyone knows for sure because they're published so widely in so many different journals that it's very difficult to keep an up-to-date record of the number. And I guess it doesn't matter. After you get past 5,000, who cares whether it's 5,200 or 300? No? All right. I wanted to briefly describe 3 different applications of the model. It is one argument for it being a general model is because it will apply to a wide variety of applications. And here are 3 of them, 3 rather different applications. One that I had nothing to do with personally, although my book did. It was the Bible for the people who ran the Stop AIDS campaign. When the epidemic began in the U.S., it began in the U.S., and when it began in the U.S., it began mainly in 3 metropolitan centers, one of which was San Francisco. And San Francisco was really ready for the epidemic. About 40% of the male population were gay because of the tolerant attitude of the city. And so the Stop AIDS campaign was organized by and for gay men to keep the epidemic from spreading in their community. They organized small group meetings of 10 or 12 gay men. They tried to attract opinion leaders to these meetings, and each meeting was addressed by a gay man who was HIV positive and who spoke in part from personal experience about means of transmission and so on. The 7,000 that were trained in these meetings, Stop AIDS estimated reached another 30,000 out of the total community of 142. So they reached critical mass. That was their goal, was to train enough leaders to reach critical mass. And then almost miraculously, the number of HIV infections per year dropped. The percent of gay men practicing unprotected anal intercourse dropped, and AIDS deaths per year dropped precipitously, although part of that drop is not really due to Stop AIDS, but it's due to antiretroviral drugs in recent years at least. So here was success. It came to be called the San Francisco model, and it spread throughout the world, even though it couldn't be applied exactly the same way in other cities because they didn't have a dense network of gay men as San Francisco did. Here's a definition of critical mass. I think you use this term, many people do. Some people call it other names, like The Tipping Point, the best title of the best-selling book by Malcolm Gladwell. Also, very wisely, the Stop AIDS movement built on the knowledge, which was then quite clear, that the very first people to adopt a new idea, the innovators, are not also the opinion leaders. They're the group who adopt next. So Stop AIDS did a lot of things that were very wise. Next. Now to a case that is much more a marketing case. In the early 1990s, California and Arizona both passed a state law requiring that in order for an auto company to sell any autos in these states, they had to sell 10% of the autos that they were selling as non-polluting. And at the time, this pretty much meant electric vehicles. So General Motors gets into this game in a large way. Its board votes $2 billion for a project to design and manufacture and market a vehicle that was originally called the Impact. The name was later changed. This was a battery-powered, very sleek-looking, aerodynamically styled, powerful electronic vehicle. Here's a photograph of the Impact, as it was called. It was silent. It was lightweight, heavily made of aluminum. Along with several marketing scholars, I worked as a consultant to GM on how to introduce the GM in Southern California and then in the Phoenix area. The first step was ads in local newspapers to recruit test drivers, and large numbers of them applied. In Sacramento, as an example, which is Jim Deering's hometown, there were 7,000 applicants in the first week. They filled out a lengthy and odious questionnaire to measure their opinion leadership and their innovativeness. It turned out that they were mavens. They were car nuts, the people who applied. 200 were selected in Sacramento, and that was typical in the 18 cities in which this introduction was launched. Each were given this 8x10 color photo of a red Impact, and they were given 50 baseball cards, little cards, with the photo on one side and performance data on the other, and they were asked to distribute these to their friends. They were supposed to post the color photo at their place of work or wherever. Then more test drivers applied and were given the questionnaire and so on and so on. The test drive was a 30-minute test drive of the Impact with a GM auto engineer sitting as a passenger beside them. The results of this expensive and very detailed introduction campaign were not satisfactory. There were only modest sales and rentals of the EV1. The Impact's name was changed to the EV1. You can imagine why Impact turned out not to be a very good name for a lightweight aluminum vehicle on the road with big, heavy SUVs and trucks and so on. And eventually, early this year, GM withdrew further rentals or sales of the EV1, and all of the EV1s that were on lease were gathered back up by GM and sent to the junk heap. In the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, there's a sad photograph of a stack of EV1s being crushed for their scrap metal, which has been sold to Japan. So that's the end of this introduction. Why did it fail? A basic reason is that battery technology was very limited at that time, and still is, so that the vehicle could never go more than about 100 miles without recharging. It had to be recharged at a 220 volt outlet, and GM hoped that as these vehicles diffused, there would be more and more 220 volt outlets, free outlets, at places like gas stations, fast food stores, and so on, and that never happened. And then the hybrid vehicles like the Toyota Prius came along in the year 2000, and furthermore, rather early on, in about 1999, the two state governments changed their mandate so that the auto industry no longer had to sell 10% of their autos as non-polluting. So everything went wrong that could go wrong with this campaign, but at least the method of introduction was probably, in my opinion, at least in retrospect, a very sound one. On now to a third application, briefly, and then to the marketing tradition in diffusion. The internet has had one of the fastest rates of diffusion of any innovation in humankind, even perhaps rivaling the cell phone. Today, well, actually 2 years ago, 2002, it's estimated that there's more than 450 million users per day of the internet. That would be 8% of the world's population, 61% of US adults. The latest data from the Pew Center, as of a couple of days ago, show that that's now 73%, risen in the last year. The internet, of course, changed as it diffused. It was constantly being reinvented. The World Wide Web, commercial services, and so on were added to it. And if we looked at the rate of diffusion of the internet, it's a spectacular example of the critical mass. 20 years to get to critical mass, and then in 12 or 13 years since, a very rapid rise of diffusion. Here's a definition of reinvention. This wasn't recognized back in the days of the hybrid seed corn study because you couldn't reinvent hybrid corn. You had to buy new hybrid seed corn every year for genetic reasons. But most innovations can be changed by the users as they adopt them, and they do with a vengeance. One of the problems with the internet's diffusion is the so-called digital divide, this gap that's created between, well, now the 73% and the 27%. The users are urban, well-educated, Anglo, higher income, they tend to be computer owners and so on. And so they can do banking services, purchase airline tickets, do all these things we do, sell old stuff that we don't want anymore on the internet, but the 27% can't. Next. In one of the solutions, one of the reasons for the gap is access. People that don't own computers or have them at work or at school can't really adopt the internet. And so since '95, the first cyber cafe, we see cyber cafes springing up in various parts of the world, especially outside the US, but also in the US in areas where poor people live who don't have their own computers. Next. I've been involved in recent years, as was mentioned in the introduction, in TAOS County. New Mexico is a very poor state. It ranks 48th or 49th in per capita income. As we say, thank God for Mississippi. And within New Mexico, one county, TAOS County, is the poorest county. Yes, it's the center of the ski industry in the winter, but that only lasts a couple of months, and the rest of the time, most people are unemployed. So there's a very low level of use of the internet in Taos County, and with a couple of colleagues in recent years, we've been establishing community access centers. some of which are cyber cafes and charge a fee, some of which are free. Outreach workers to try to teach people how to use a computer and the internet in their home, and then special websites on the internet that are of special interest to the people in Taos County. Taos has a very high percent of diabetes, very high rate of obesity, and a concern with nutrition is very important. And we find that individuals can learn to use computers and the internet rather easily. Okay? Now let's turn to the final part of my presentation, and the one of probably greatest interest to you, and that's the rise of diffusion research in marketing. In 1962, when I wrote the first edition of Diffusion of Innovations, there were only a handful of diffusion publications. They dealt with consumer innovations, and there were only a couple of them. So few that I didn't even consider marketing as one of the 6 main traditions or fields doing diffusion research. And to my surprise, when I look back at my 1962 edition, marketing wasn't even cited in the index to the book. So it was just sort of out of sight as far as diffusion was concerned. In 2003, at the time of the 5th edition of my book, marketing studies represented 16% of all diffusion publications, the 5,000 plus, and rising fast. It was one of the most important diffusion traditions. Why this growth? Well, a very important reason is Frank Bass, another Converse winner, and his forecasting model. I met Frank for the first time at a small marketing conference at Purdue University. I was at Michigan State University at the time. And I remember he and I having rather intense conversations during the 2 days of this conference about diffusion. He was very interested in it, very knowledgeable about it, and very puzzled at the time as to why no one had made a forecasting model based on what had been found post hoc about diffusion. Professor de Kimpt, a European marketing scholar, states that the Bass model is the most popular model in the field of marketing. In any event, there's a large number of studies using the Bass model. There's several published each year, and that's been going on since the Bass model was first published in 1969. The model has been used widely by marketing scholars. It's also been used by non-marketing scholars. It has grown to have some followers outside of marketing, and has been used with a very wide range of innovations, not all of which have a marketing focus. So I think that's one big reason for the rapid growth of interest in diffusion in the marketing field, was the forecasting model and its possibilities of testing whether these predictions then were coming true or not. Another reason of lesser importance is social marketing, the application of commercial marketing strategies to nonprofit products and services, such things as contraceptives in India and other countries, getting people to have blood tests for AIDS, and other preventive health innovations. Philip Kotler at Northwestern, and Jerry Zaltman, who was also at Northwestern at the time, wrote some of the first publications about social marketing, and they've been used widely or applied widely in marketing and by many people outside of the field of marketing. Social marketing is one of the hot ideas in the field of public health today. So I think these two developments were quite crucial in this rapid expansion of interest in the diffusion model in the marketing field. there's some special qualities of marketing diffusion research that indicate their unique contribution. One is this greater concern with prediction. Almost none of the other traditions of diffusion study, none of them, to my extent, have an interest in forecasting or prediction. And in marketing, of course, thanks to Frank Bass's model, we do. The marketing diffusion studies are also, many of them are experimental studies, often field experiments, in which, in collaboration with the marketer, the company that owns the product that's being introduced, it is introduced in one way, method A as opposed to method B, and the two are compared. And thus we've been able to learn some things in marketing about diffusion that other traditions have not explored. And in general, the marketing studies are more quantitative. I'm sure you're not surprised, but they're not all quantitative. Today, there's a number of marketing diffusion studies underway of new telecommunication technologies, like cell phones, well, and the internet, in various countries. And there's a strong tradition of international comparisons of rates of diffusion by marketing scholars. Now for a couple of conclusions, one of which I think is the strong evidence from applications and from the growth of interest in the diffusion field to various scholarly fields, that it is indeed a general process, that it does apply across a range of conditions, different kinds of people, different kinds of innovations, and there are general patterns and regularities that emerge. And really that's what I devoted my life, my career to mainly, is documenting these general patterns and regularities. And my books have all argued for a general diffusion model. The diffusion research is 60 years old, and most models don't last that long in any field. And here, the interest in the diffusion model seems to be going on, chugging along at about the same rate as previously. By my calculations, there's about 120 new diffusion publications a year. Roughly 20 of those would be in the field of marketing. And so interest in the tradition seems to be continuing, and I expect it will in the future. But there's never going to be a 6th edition of my diffusion book. I'm done writing those. Thank you very much.